going to keep blethering for a bit until we actually get a full audience in the room, and then you declare a formal start in about, I think in about 45 seconds time by the looks of things. Right, our numbers I think are starting to stabilize, which means everybody who's arriving on time is probably arriving, and everyone who's arriving late will be here in 5 minutes. So good. Right, I will hereby formally call things to order and say good morning to everybody. Thank you all very much for coming here today to the Virtual Social Market Foundation. If we haven't met, I'm James Kirkup. I'm the director of the SMF. You are here, I hope you're aware, for a speech by Nick Gibb, the schools minister, who is very kindly, you'll see, sporting SMF colours in his backdrop in the department today in a way that I'm not in my house, which is shameful for me, but never mind. A little bit of housekeeping from me before Nick gets underway. You will have seen in the top left-hand side corner of your screen a couple of notices. One, that this is being recorded, and two, that we are streaming live to YouTube. I just say this because later on we're going to have the opportunity to have questions and discussions with Nick, and so if you are part of that discussion, bear in mind that you're not just speaking to the cozy confines of the people in this Zoom session, but actually to the whole of the internet, and that anything you say is going to be recorded for online posterity forever and ever and ever. In terms of the running order, in a second, Nick will give us his speech, and then after that we've got the opportunity for some questions and conversations. I will abuse my prerogative as chair to ask Nick a question or two, and I'll then hand over to all of you for your questions. Depending on how many we get, we'll try to put people who want to ask questions on camera so you can put the questions directly. But it may be that if we've got lots of queries coming in, I might have to try and rapidly summarize questions that are popping up in both I mentioned the Q&A and chat panels. No matter how hard we try on these things, people always insist on using both to make my life extra hard. So do feel free to put questions, comments in both Q&A and chat. I'll try and watch them both as we go along. And then I say we'll come, when it comes to questions, we'll both repeat, we'll pass them on to Nick and put some of you on camera for those questions. Before I stop going on at you and hand over to Nick, I should just say, because some of you I think are, some of you have been to the SMF before, some of you might not know us. If you don't, the SMF is a cross-party think tank, normally based at Westminster, literally in the shadow of the DFE, in fact, on Tufton Street. So we work with people across all parties on a number of different policy and political questions, a couple of which are being discussed here by the minister. One obviously is, one is the straightforward question of education policy, how to make education better and better for everybody who does it. But there's a second, slightly more ethereal question that we're very interested in as I guess a centrist, centre ground, middle ground think tank, which is the idea of cultural and social cohesion. What is it that brings us together? What do we have in common in the, to use a terrible think tank word, in the British polity, if you like? And that's something I think we're going to hear something from the minister on shortly. So I'm very interested in that bit too. So that's the the SMF perspective on this. Why I'm very pleased to have Nick back at the SMF. In fact, we had him here a couple of years ago, back in the real world, if you can remember that, for a speech in 2019. So evidently we all thought that went well, so I thought we'd do it again. And maybe one day again we will do it again back in the real world if we ever get back there. So something to look forward to. Anyway, with that, I am going to, you'll be pleased to know, mute myself and hand over to Nick Gibb, who will give you a speech. Nick, good morning.
Good morning, James, and thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this event today. Thank you to the SMF for all the work that you do, and thank you for lending us your banner. James, school reform has been central to the Conservative agenda since 2010. And we have made good progress, but there is still more to do. And the challenge has become still more urgent by the days of lost education that have resulted from the pandemic. My belief and my argument today is that we will only deliver on the promises that all politicians make of ensuring that every child receives a first-class education, if we ensure that all our children are taught in schools with an extensive, knowledge-rich curriculum by well-trained and supported teachers, in schools where strong discipline means that pupils are taught in a safe and caring environment with high expectations and where success is rewarded and celebrated, in schools that develop character and resilience, in schools that encompass the arts, languages, music, and the humanities, as well as science and maths, and in schools that give every child the knowledge that they are entitled to as part of their cultural inheritance. If every school delivers these key objectives, only then will we succeed in reducing the gap between children who come from backgrounds where the importance of education can sometimes take a back seat to the trials of day-to-day living, and those whose families have the time and ability to add to the education that their children receive at school. This approach is central to our plan to spread opportunity and to level up, and an important way in which we can rise to the challenge of creating a more inclusive and cohesive society, a society in which argument and debate is based on evidence rather than emotion. And yet, some have been using the pandemic to argue for a different approach, for a reheated so-called progressive agenda to abolish GCSEs, for example, which would take our education system back decades and once again fail the most disadvantaged children. Since 2010, the reforms that we put in place have been driven by the idea that the transmission of rich subject knowledge should be the priority for schools. We replaced the 2007 national curriculum because it was based on a series of general aptitudes with insufficient subject-based content. And in its place, we introduced a national curriculum which gives people a grounding in the best that has been thought and said. And we gave schools freedom over how to teach it, trusting teachers to do their best for pupils. But the thinking behind this approach goes back decades. In the late 1970s, an American literary analyst and professor, E.D. Hirsch, made a discovery. He ran tests that found that community college students performed worse than university students when it came to understanding how different styles of writing influenced comprehension. And he was dismayed because it was poorer students who were doing worse. And he found something enlightening, that while community college students could read and write as well as their university contemporaries, they failed whenever background knowledge was involved. Despite the Civil War being a central event in American history, they couldn't understand passages of text about the subject because they hadn't been taught elementary facts that many Americans take for granted. It was a lack of knowledge that was the problem. And it's by no means just an American problem. In The Strange Death of History Teaching, published in 2009, Derek Matthews, an economics lecturer at Cardiff University, reported results of a short history test that he gave to 280 undergraduates over a 3-year period. 60% didn't know Brunel's profession. 65% didn't know who the reigning monarch was at the time of the Armada. 83% didn't know that Wellington led the British Army at Waterloo. And 88% couldn't name a single 19th century prime minister. Derek Matthews blamed the drive to teach historical skills rather than historical knowledge as a key cause of the problem. And as Hirsch writes, knowledge should be thought of as mental Velcro. People who have lots of subject-specific knowledge find that new knowledge sticks to it, helping them to commit the new information to long-term memory. In the same vein, a lack of subject-specific knowledge can mean that new concepts slip past you or that you make mistakes. And the outcome of this is completely predictable. Those with more prior knowledge learn more than those with limited prior knowledge, and therefore the gap between these two groups widens. And in his book, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them, Hirsch describes this as the Matthew effect, drawing on Matthew chapter 25. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. but from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. And this gap can widen drastically if we're not careful, because there is an accumulative advantage that pupils with large vocabularies experience once they start school. Put simply, because they know more, they learn more, and the gap between them and their less advantaged peers grows ever wider. I believe it is the job of schools to close this gap by making sure that every child is taught the same knowledge, what Hirsch describes as communal knowledge. We can't anymore ignore the evidence that shows that pupils from less advantaged backgrounds are less likely than their peers to access this communal knowledge at home, who by contrast enjoy frequent guided reading with parents from a young age, as well as rich conversations at the family dinner table as they grow older. So teaching a knowledge-rich curriculum is essential to the task of spreading opportunity and leveling up. Of course, we can never make sure that every child has exactly the same opportunities in their family life, but it's because of this that our schools must be bastions of knowledge, so children can, as Newton said, stand on the shoulder of giants. I'm inspired by the passion of so many that so many young people show for changing the world. I've been privileged to meet Malala, whose determined bravery is doing so much to promote female education around the world. I share the admiration for England's young football team, who are standing up against the hate encountered every day by so many on social media because of their race, gender, their beliefs, or simply for who they are. And I've been impressed by the insistence of children that we take action to address climate change, which has helped to shape the government's approach to preparing for COP26 in Glasgow this autumn. I believe that together we can achieve great things. We can ensure that this generation leaves a better and fairer world for the next. But we won't do this by turning our back on the past. It is knowledge of what came before us, of the battles that led to victory or to defeat, of the experiments that led to discovery or to failure, the actions of leaders that led to change or to untold inhumanity. Without knowledge of all that came before, we will fail to create that better world. A common trope in the Western world today is that the rise of the internet has made the memorization of knowledge redundant, akin to those in an earlier generation saying that the invention of calculators meant that we didn't need to teach children arithmetic. In recent years, many academics in universities, schools of education, leaders of tech businesses, and politicians of all stripes have argued that with the world's information at our fingertips, the focus of school should be less about teaching maths formula or historical dates. Instead, they suggest that schools should focus on teaching pupils so-called 21st century skills, such as how to be more creative, to work in teams, and to be problem solvers. This notion of generic skills is one of the most damaging myths in education today. Skills exist within subject disciplines. They aren't generic. This means that they rely on the acquisition of underpinning knowledge. And it's fanciful to believe that a thinking skill in one domain can be readily and reliably transferred to other domains. It is ignorant of the evidence of how people learn. The ability to just Google it is highly dependent on what a person has stored in their long-term memory. And this focus on competency over knowledge is actually a tepid vision for education. In her landmark book, 7 Myths About Education, Daisy Christodoulou deconstructs the myth that the way to develop pupil expertise in subjects like science or history is to teach them to think like expert scientists or expert historians. She writes, and I quote, "The difference between experts and novices is that experts have a huge body of background knowledge and processes stored in long-term memory, and that they have spent a huge amount of time practicing using that knowledge and those processes. In most fields, it takes several years and thousands of hours to become an expert." And she adds, there is no shortcut, strategy, or tactic that can bridge that gap. So every lesson that a teacher spends trying to make experts out of children through teaching them to think like an expert, rather than focusing on the essential building blocks of knowledge required on the path from novice to expert, is a lesson wasted. Accumulated over weeks, terms, and academic years, pupils taught in this way are having the opportunities that rich subject knowledge brings taken away from them. Rather than setting pupils' hearts alight with the beauty of great music and art, or giving them the gift of fluency in reading and arithmetic and maths, they be subject to a mundane, content-light curriculum tilted towards the world of work. Far from being innovative and new, it is a rehash of the failed child-led approaches which view the teaching of knowledge as Gradgrindian rather than the cultural inheritance of every child. As Pritesh Rachura, a teacher from Michaela Community School, writes in their book, The Power of Culture, an excellent curriculum in any discipline ought to be a curated tour of the most influential creators of the knowledge that contributes to that particular discipline. And he adds, in literature, this must include Shakespeare; in physics, Newton; in music, Mozart. Why? Because these thinkers' works have endured for centuries. Time and time again, they have been hailed as being remarkable contributions to our civilization. There are some who say that such knowledge is outdated. How, they say, can a child today relate to the work of an early 17th century playwright or an 18th century composer? I believe the job of the teacher, and our best teachers indeed do this, is to teach a curriculum which opens up a world of wonder and beauty from people of all creeds and colors, far beyond the narrow experience of an individual child. A curriculum based on relevance to pupils is to deny them an introduction to the best that has been thought and said. And of course, there is no reason why the work of a dead white man is not appropriate for children from ethnic minorities to learn about. As Maya Angelou famously said, Shakespeare must be a black girl because his poetic words expressed so intensely what she, a victim of poverty, racism, and childhood sexual abuse, felt inside. We will not create a more harmonious, tolerant, and equal society through promoting a curriculum based on relevance to or representativeness of any one group. Nor will we do so by being ashamed of who we are and where we came from. One of the many hugely impressive things about Gareth Southgate is his ability to speak so clearly of the things that unite us as a country. At the beginning of Euro 2020, he wrote about how shared experiences, common memories, and family history all come together to build a collective consciousness, and how our collective experience builds a sense of pride. His England team, drawn from right across England and including players not only of great skill, but from very different backgrounds, demonstrated a sense of togetherness and pride, conscious of the achievements and failures of the past, determined to achieve success and live up to the expectations and hopes placed upon them, which inspired the country. Gareth Southgate has shown us how we can respect the past and build a different and better future. We can't rewrite our history or undo our past mistakes. We should be honest and tell the full and true story of who we are and what as a country we have done right and wrong. And by doing so, we can build a broad and accepted understanding of the country and create a common sense of belonging and shared history. And the broader the knowledge is that is taught, the more inclusive it can be. E.D. Hirsch showed what is possible with his core knowledge curriculum. In his book, What Your Fifth Grader Needs to Know, he shows that 10 to 11-year-old pupils, equivalent to our last year of primary school, can learn an incredible amount In just a single academic year, they will cover the Maya, Aztecs and Incas, the discovery of the New World, including the transatlantic slave trade, the European Renaissance and Reformation, including the role played by Muslim scholars in contributing to discoveries in maths and science, 15th to 18th century England, Russia, Japanese history, Western expansion in North America, the US Civil War and Reconstruction, and Native Americans and the impact of settlers. This is an incredible amount of subject content, and we need to be ambitious for what our children and young people can achieve, because they can do it. Throughout their time in school, all British pupils can learn about the arc of history, from the ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece and China, to a millennium of British history up to the two world wars and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Taught well, pupils exposed to this knowledge would learn about the struggles and achievements of peoples from all races. Taught well, this curriculum is diverse and inclusive. This is because it is powerful knowledge, that which, as Professor Michael Young of the Institute of Education writes in a piece for the Cambridge Journal of Education, is powerful because it provides the best understanding of the natural and social worlds that we have and helps us to go beyond our individual experiences. The more shared knowledge we have as a society, the more integrated and inclusive that society. And the vehicle for delivering that shared knowledge is our school system, but only if schools teach a knowledge-based rather than competence-based curriculum. A broad and rich knowledge-based curriculum, as well as being a vehicle for inclusion, can also help to bring civility, nuance, and evidence to some of the heated debates that dominate public discourse. Our schools should be unashamed champions of knowledge, citadels of civilized debate where pupils are encouraged to express views and discuss ideas. Young people have always felt the urge to question and challenge the world they are brought up in. I did. I'm sure that you did too. Indeed, it is a key role of our education system to equip young people to test arguments and assumptions, not to tell children what to think, but to give them the knowledge they need to ensure that their passion is grounded in fact. Over the last few months, I have been worried by video clips on Twitter and by reports from schools around the country of violent and angry protests sparked by the recent unrests in Gaza. The violence and the terrible loss of life was yet another turn in a conflict with deep and complicated roots, which can't be understood without an understanding of the past. To understand the situation in Israel and Palestine, we need to give young people important facts about the world. We need to teach them about the Balfour Declaration, the Six-Day War. We need to teach them about the religious significance of Jerusalem to both Jews and Muslims. We need to teach them about the expansion of Jewish settlements. The aim is not to prejudice children, it's to give them the facts so that they can make informed analysis themselves. And it is to provide them with the knowledge they need to understand and to challenge and to form their own views. We must be on our guard to ensure that schools don't become centers of one-sided propaganda or a hostile environment for young people of any faith or religion. And as we've seen over the last few years, anti-Israeli sentiment can too easily and too quickly turn into anti-Semitic prejudice. Ensuring young people are equipped with knowledge is ever more important with the rise of social media, where false narratives based on fake news are drawing people in, especially the young, with the starkness of their message and the simplicity of their solutions. The old misguided argument of progressives that we could downplay knowledge because children could look up facts in encyclopedias has been blown away in the internet age. Online, there is no simple reservoir of facts that children can access and know to be true. So much is nuanced around creating a narrative argument that suits an agenda. A 2012 PISA study found that the majority of students consider material they encounter on the internet first in terms of relevance or interest, rather than looking at the reliability of its source. This is a real problem with dangerous impacts. It means students may believe what they read purely because it's interesting to them. We have a responsibility to make sure that young people are able to tell the difference between truth and falsehood, and that the driving force of the Enlightenment, the commitment to reason and the pursuit of truth in the face of religious dogma and political bigotry, remains central to human progress in the 21st century. It's our moral duty to teach them important facts and truths delivered through a well-sequenced, knowledge-rich curriculum. A 21st century curriculum must have the transfer of knowledge at its core, to pass the parcel, as Hector said in Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys. And that's why I believe that we are the true romantics, believing in education for education's sake. We want to make sure that every child is taught a broad, ambitious, and knowledge-rich curriculum, at least until the age of 16. The teaching of a broad and balanced academic curriculum is central to leveling up. It is central to pupil well-being. It is central to preparing pupils for the 21st century. And that's why our reforms to the national curriculum were so important. And that's why the EBAC, the English Baccalaureate performance measure, introduced to ensure that all children have the opportunity to be taught the type of academic curriculum too often restricted to pupils from more privileged backgrounds, is so vital. Our ambition is for 75% of Year 10 pupils in mainstream state-funded schools to study these GCSEs by September 2022 and 90% by 2025. We are ahead of target on 4 of the 5 EBAC subject pillars, where uptake has exceeded our ambition for 2022, with the exception being languages, which is at approximately 46%. And between 2011 and 2020, there was a 19.3 percentage point rise in the proportion of disadvantaged pupils in state-funded schools entering for the EBAC. We have taken huge strides, I believe, over the past decade. Many schools across the nation have risen to the challenge of putting a knowledge-rich curriculum at the core of what they do. From Michaela Community School in London to Dixon's Trinity Academy in Bradford, and all those involved with the Midland Knowledge Schools hub based at St. Martin's Catholic Academy in Stoke Golding, committed teachers and head teachers are showing that children flourish when given the gift of knowledge. But there is more to do. The government is energetic and focused in its mission to break the link between background and destiny. And our schools have a crucial role to play by making sure that every child is taught the knowledge they need to grasp the opportunities the failed approaches of the past were denying them. We are undeterred by the pandemic that we're living through, and by working together and through the teaching of a knowledge-rich curriculum, we can truly level up across the country and give children the education that they deserve. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you very much, Nick. Lots to chew on there, and people are indeed starting to chew and digest in the Q&A and chat panel. Questions are coming in. I'm going to give everyone a minute to further digest and put some more questions in that Q&A panel before I start going out to the audience for questions. I'm going to, as promised, abuse my prerogative as chair to ask you a couple, well, one or two questions, I suppose, before I turn to everybody else. I mean, yeah, and I should say, by the way, not a question, an observation. You mentioned grad grind or a grad grinding approach to education, which reminded me that not that long ago, because the SMF is very interested in skills and productivity. Not that long ago, someone I forget who conveniently accused the SMF of being a joyless neoliberal grad grinding organisation, which I thought was one of the nicest things anyone had said about us for ages. But I think Mr. Grad Grind gets a bad press sometimes. But we'll pass over that. The question, I suppose, my first question is: you invoke Arnold, the best that's been said and thought, and the idea of a core set of facts that everyone should know, sort of intellectual anchor, I suppose, in a sort of in the trackless seas of the internet, which is an appealing idea, but it does raise one pretty obvious question: who decides? I mean, your core facts that everybody should know that will allow them to navigate this online era. Who should decide what those facts, what that knowledge is?
I mean, it's a very good question, and it is the fear of that question that I think tempts people to move down a competence-based curriculum, because it's simpler to say, well, we'll just teach teach a child how to be a historian, teach them about evidence and chronology and so on, rather than have to make some of those difficult decisions about what to teach and what not to teach because of limited time. But I think there is in reality, there is a commonly accepted view about what needs to be taught. How you go about doing that, I think, is through consultation with the sector, with teachers, with parents, with pupils, and to have in practical terms, you form a committee of experts in the field, and we've done a similar thing with the model music curriculum, actually, which is a very detailed curriculum about what we think children in school should be taught in terms of music, notation, what music they should be listening to, and so on, and how to compose and create. And we formed a committee headed by Veronica Wadley, and it contained music teachers and well-known musicians like Julian Lloyd Webber, and they came up with this model music. It's not statutory, it's not compulsory, but it's sought to gather the best that is happening in our school system across the country, make it even better, and then publish it, and people can use it or not use it. And I think that a similar approach, you look to see what schools are doing up and down the country. You form a committee of experts, they do their very best, and then you consult, and then you tweak.
To be clear, in case anybody's got the wrong impression, you're not proposing to sit in your commissar's office in Whitehall and produce an approved list of government facts to be taught to children up and down the country.
No, absolutely not. And I think it's because of the fear of that politicians have shied away from this kind of work. One of the things I've wanted to do for a long time is to make sure children are reading the canon, but of course no one can agree what the canon is. And again, that's why there is no reading list. And yet I think that we all love reading lists, and I think they are very useful. Very useful. I'm working my way through the Pulitzer Prize for fiction lists year by year, because it's a list, and it's a fun thing to do. But so I think there is a case for doing it, but you do have to be very careful. You have to make sure that you are consulting widely. And try and seeking a consensus across the country. I think that consensus does emerge.
I think I've formed an informal question order in my head, which no one else knows about, but that point will be further discussed in a couple of questions' time, I think. So, but the first, I would actually like, if that's okay, we have someone, and I'm going to get one of my colleagues to do this, and from the wings, we have someone who told me his name is Matthew. He's logged in as Class of Your Own. Now, Matthew, if you don't mind, I'd like you to I'd like to put you on camera, as it were, so you can actually put your question directly to the minister, partly because it comes from personal experience. I think we've got quite I know. I'm hoping someone is. In fact, maybe I can do this. Can I? No, this is beyond my technical abilities. Sorry. Anyone? The joy of Zoom. Do we have? This is when I feel like a provincial radio DJ. I've got Matthew now, calling from Ludlow. Matthew's got a question about dogs. No, we don't. I can't see Matthew. Oh, there you are, Matthew. You're appearing. Wait, I think we can hear you, Matthew. Can you? I think we can hear you, if not see you, Matthew. Would you like?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. That's good. That's good enough. Go ahead. Go, Matthew.
Excellent. Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in this because I work in the education landscape, and we work, across the built environment sector and engineering sector. I'm thinking about my own background and childhood. So when I was a teenager, I wasn't particularly interested in knowledge and in, frankly, listening to teachers and a variety of other let's say problems I had growing up as a teenager. it's likely that I wouldn't have passed maths GCSE without coursework. I did very well in coursework. I got 97, 98%, but in exams, I was failing. I went on to study A-level in maths. I then went to university to study chemical engineering, and I've since had a career that's enabled me to work with, lots of very bright and capable engineers on projects around the world that I'm kind of very proud of, given my background and where I came from. I look at this landscape and I think, well, without that coursework, I wouldn't have been able to really choose that path and go on that route into engineering. And I probably would have ended up left in the town that I grew up in, frankly, struggling to find a career there. So my question was, what would you say to my 15-year-old self that, instead of being able to go on and have the varied global, if you like, career that I've had, that I wouldn't be able to do that I would be left really in that town, probably struggling, frankly.
Do you want me to come back, James, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, please do. Yes, so I'm very into this conversation. Go ahead.
Yes, well, Matthew's talking about not the content of the curriculum, but how it's assessed and how qualifications are awarded. And Matthew's advocating controlled assessments, which is a system we had before our reforms in the 2011-12 reforms. And the reason why we removed controlled assessment for most subjects, including maths, was because it was consuming a vast amount of teaching time. And Ofqual also said that it wasn't actually a very reliable form of assessment. And that's why we've moved to assessment through exams at the end of the 2-year course, a synoptic exam on the whole of the course. And that is the more effective. And I believe it's a fairer way of assessing pupils. In terms of individuals and how they cope with exams, I've had this question a few years ago in a select committee, and I made the point that actually practice is actually a good way of helping young people and children to deal with the stresses of exams, so that they're used to doing them. And I think that actually what has happened in too many schools, at least until our reforms were introduced, is that those end of year exams that were routine sort of slipped away from the system as the focus on the importance of retaining knowledge slipped away, because schools were focusing more on these competencies, and they downplayed the importance of not just being taught knowledge, but actually retaining it. And if you were to read Daniel Willingham's book, Why Students Don't Like School, he makes the important point that an educated person does have a lot of retained knowledge in their long-term memory, and that's how you are able to access that retained knowledge through your working memory. How you become a problem solver or a critical thinker is being able to access a large quantity of retained knowledge into your working memory, which can only cope with a certain 6 or 7 pieces of new knowledge at a time. So you need that retained knowledge to be able to be a critical thinker or a problem solver, and that's why it's important that our school system is helping children to remember the content of the subjects that they're being taught. And exams are a helpful way of doing that. There's a lot of evidence that just preparing for exams, revising for exams, helps you to retain that knowledge.
Thank you. Now, the next, next question is going to be from a journalist. I'm favouring the media I'm a recovering journalist myself. So, Will Hazel, I don't know where, if we can put Will on up in lights somewhere. I don't know if, where are you, Will?
I'm here. Thank you, James. I think my camera might not be working, but I hope you can hear me.
Nobody needs to see any more journalists. Tell us who you are, Will, and ask you a question.
Thank you. My name is Will Hazel. I'm the education correspondent for the I newspaper. Mr. Gibb, I was very interested in what you said about how the pandemic has reheated progressive arguments, and particularly the argument for the abolition of GCSEs. But some of the people who are making that argument aren't sort of traditional progressives. You'll have seen that John Major said recently in the Times that he disliked GCSEs because of the stresses and strains they put on people. Lord Baker has obviously been very vocal about this for some time, believes they're unnecessary and should be abolished. But even recent education secretaries, Conservative education secretaries like Baroness Morgan said that she felt we needed to revisit how we conducted exams, and Justin Greening as well questioned whether they're fit for purpose. I was just wondering what your response would be to those Conservative colleagues.
I respectfully disagree. I think that the GCSE, they can always, every curriculum, every exam, of course, can always be improved, but the concept of having an exam across a range of subjects at the age of 16, I think is an important part of our school system. It's been a similar system has been in place for many decades, and it does. Something like nearly half of students at the age of 16 move on to a different institution, which is unusual compared to other countries. And actually, there are many children. There's a large minority of young people for whom the GCSE exam will be the last academic qualification they take. They may go on to very high quality vocational qualification, but in 5-10 years time, they may decide to change that vocation to something else, and then they then will need to be able to demonstrate to a future employer or future college that they have academic achievements when they were at school. So I think it would be a huge mistake to abolish the tried and tested GCSEs and the reforms that we put through that finished in about 2016 and 2017, I believe have made our GCSEs into a very high quality exam that I believe is a gold standard, and we should be proud of those qualifications.
Thank you. Next person I'd come to is Lamaya Sharay from the APPG for Race Equality in Education. Now, I think Lamaya is, for my SMF colleagues, Lamaya is logged in as Enact Inequality, if you're looking for her to put her on audio.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can indeed. What's your question, Lamaya?
Fantastic, thank you. My question is really two-pronged. So considering, I'm sure you're aware of the House of Commons Petitions Committee, as there was a debate in the House of Commons about this recently, considering that 90% of respondents to the Petitions Committee felt there should be a statutory requirement for all children to be taught explicitly about the history of Britain's ethnic and cultural minorities, why has the Department for Education refused to make Black history lessons mandatory in English schools, as will be the case in Wales in 2022? And I mean, it would be great if you could take into consideration the fact that 69% of survey respondents strongly disagreed that the curriculum and the freedom and flexibility that it's intended to give teachers guarantees that children leave primary school with an appropriate understanding of Britain's diverse history. And secondly, couldn't the Department for Education replicate the model used in the music lessons consultation that you referenced during this event to the teaching of Black history in English schools as well, for example?
So two prongs for you, Minister.
Yes, and I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think there is a case for model history curriculum on the grounds, on the way that we have for music. The point I was making in my speech was really addressing the very issue that you have raised. And I think that a very rich knowledge-based curriculum will enable schools to teach all those things that you have talked about, and how Britain became Britain as it is today, the changes that happened in the 20th century, but also the changes that took place in the 19th and the 18th and the 17th century. And I cited from the book during my speech, the E.D. Hirsch book, What Your Fifth Grader Needs to Know. And he's published, a book like this for every grade 1 right through to, I think, 12. And the level of knowledge that Hirsch is saying should be taught, and there are schools in America that do teach this curriculum through the Core Knowledge Foundation very successfully. If you cover everything in this curriculum, you will inevitably have covered a diverse range of world history and more detail of the history of this country. And that's what I'm seeking to advocate today, that if you teach a rich knowledge-based curriculum, that is the best way to ensure that children from all backgrounds learn about the important elements of their own cultural history, as well as the shared cultural history of this country. And those children who are not from that cultural background will also have that knowledge of the history of all the children's background that make up Britain as it is today. That's what I've been trying to advocate in what I've been saying today.
Thank you. I'd like to briefly sort of explore that a bit more with Nick, but just to put something else on notice. After I've done that, I want to go to Bethan Marshall from King's College. I think he's got a question afterwards. So just to give my colleagues notice to try and click the button on Bethan in a second. But I suppose I just want to follow up really to make sure I properly understood what your speech on the points that Lorraine touches on there, Nick. Because you said quite clearly, I think, that you don't think that teaching should be tailored to sort of particular groups or experience. That there should be a core and universal body of knowledge. So where does the concept of a distinct, discrete Black history teaching fit in that? I mean, I think what you're saying is, I risk of putting words in your mouth here, I think what you're saying is that good comprehensive teaching of the history of Britain will cover and teach all of the points that would be contained in a Black history module, but might not necessarily be labelled explicitly as such.
I think that is a good summary of what I'm talking about. Of course, children need to know how Britain became Britain as it is today. And there are important events, Windrush, just to pick one event that children do need to be taught about. But they also need to be taught about all the other events that led to Britain as it is today. And all children need to be taught about all these things. That is my point. And I think children should also understand and be taught more about the history of the world, because Britain as it is today has been influenced by the geography and history of the world. So important events, one of the things that's in this fifth grader book is Japanese feudalism. Now that, I don't know what impact that has had on Britain, but I think that it's important that children are taught about that, because it's something that, it affects the world. Children ought to be taught about the history of the continent of Africa and the important events that happened in that continent and the countries within that continent, and the impact that has had on this country, and the same for the Indian subcontinent, and the same for Europe, and the same for the other parts of Asia and the Americas. I think and then you'll say to me, James, wow, that's a huge quantum of knowledge. And of course, it won't be taught in necessarily the same depth as if you were spending a half term on the Incas or the Aztecs. But if you teach it in a knowledge-rich way and make sure that you can cover a vast area, you are introducing people to a greater volume of knowledge that I think is important in so many ways. It's important for their cognitive development, but it's also important, and this is the direction the speech was seeking to make, is that it is by definition inclusive, and particularly if it's taught to all children and they all have this common knowledge of the kind of things that I was talking about.
Thank you. Honestly, my only response to that would be, that sounds great. Speaking of somebody who left school with a pitifully low knowledge of history and spent the last 30 odd years trying to make up for it. I'm all for that. The more history, the better, I think. Anyway, that's enough about me, far too much about me. Let's hear about Bethan Marshall instead. Bethan.
Yes, I'm really interested in the knowledge-rich curriculum, because I think that knowledge in English is not the same as it is in science or maths or indeed in history. And yet it's being treated as exactly the same thing. And it's to the detriment of the English curriculum, I think, in schools. It's more about dialogue and interpretation rather than facts. So is there any other way or any other approaches that we could adopt for English, which is, as I say, really very different from the knowledge that you've been talking about?
Well, I think you make an important point. I think if there is one area that is, if you like, a skill that is transferable across multiple domains, it is the skill of reading. if you can read English literature, and you can also read science. So I think the reason that we focus so strongly on the technical reading ability of children when we came into office in 2010 was we wanted to make sure that every child leaves primary school at the very latest as not just a reader, but a fluent and sophisticated reader, because that then unlocks the curriculum at secondary school. And I also think it's important that children are introduced. So first of all, they build up their fluency. So they learn the basic mechanics of reading through phonics. They build up their reading speed, and they then become increasingly fluent. They build up their vocabulary by being read to. We've just published, Beth, and I'm sure you know, the reading framework that a group of experts have put together about how you build that fluency and vocabulary and make sure children are read to, and so on. Just basically trying to codify, summarize best practice in reading. And then I think children should be introduced to the canon and be encouraged to read for themselves some of the important works of literature that, again, have made our country the country it is today. And they should also be reading literature from around the world. There are important authors from all the continents. I think children should also be introduced to during their school curriculum. I think that is, again, part of how you ensure you have an inclusive curriculum.
Thank you. Now we're into our last 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple, well, certainly at least one more person before I start doing potted summaries of questions. And the person I'm looking for on my list is John Kay. I don't know, John, what the K stands for, but John Kay, who I know is a chair of governors, who had a couple of observations. I don't know if we can find.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm chair of governors of a school in Tottenham, and my response, I agreed with many of the points Nick made, but I thought he let his slip show a bit when he spoke about progressives and really exaggerated the role of skills. Surely it's a false dichotomy between knowledge and skills. In my view, you need both. Certainly, in terms of knowledge, we've been working as a group of schools in Haringey to develop a humanities knowledge-based curriculum. That's incredibly difficult. I mean, we actually did 1 year, we did year 3. Last year we did year 4, and next year we're going to do year 5. Masses and masses of work. I've observed some of this teaching. I've spoken to the year 3 pupils, and I'm deeply impressed by their knowledge. I mean, another thing I've done since retiring from full-time work is to be a guide at Westminster Abbey in their education department. I've taken hundreds of children around the Abbey with different themes and different focus, and I agree with Nick. Many of them have, it's incredible the gaps in some of their knowledge, but what's also incredible is the deep knowledge other children have. You can't predict which is which. So I think
John, could I
my worry is that Nick is trying to set up a culture war when we should have a steady development of what works best for children, particularly poor children.
I was about to steer you to a question, but you've just done that yourself. Johnny. I'll put that to him for you. Nick Gibb, are you trying to set up a culture war?
No, I'm trying to make an argument. And again, I think arguments need to be civilized and conducted in a non-militaristic fashion, as part of what I was saying in my remarks. But there is a debate about knowledge versus skills. And I've made 2 points. First of all, I agree with you. Of course, you need both. But I would also say that you don't get those skills unless you have the knowledge. You can't just teach the skills. And I'm afraid that there is a big opinion, a sense of opinion in the education sector that thinks you can teach those skills directly. And what I would argue is that you get those skills, whether it's working scientifically, whether it's the skills of a historian, whether it's the critical thinking, problem solving, creativity. You get all those skills by immersing yourself into the subject, understanding the detail and the nuance of the subject is how you then acquire those skills. And then you also require increasingly sophisticated reading skills by reading the books that help you to acquire the knowledge in those areas. So that's what I'm seeking to do. I'm delighted by what I hear you saying, John, about what's happening in your school. Of course, it does require a lot of work to move from a a topic-based, if you like, approach to the curriculum and to move into a properly sequenced knowledge-based curriculum. And I'm delighted that you're doing it. I'd love to visit your school at some point if you can let us have details about the chat.
I'll do that, yeah.
Now we've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to try and do two things very quickly. Because I've got one question from another friend in the media, which is admirably brief, and a broader thematic question on the speech. Now I'll start with the thematic question. I'm just going to read it out, in fact, to save time. It's from Martin Robinson. I'm going to summarize very briefly. Who essentially is picking up on this idea of the canon. He says, the enduring for centuries model leaves too much out. New science replaces old, new art builds on the conversation of the past. Maya Angelou hasn't endured for centuries, nor has Hirsch. Or Southgate, you rely on them to make your argument. How can schools ensure they are not limiting children's ability to think, converse, and feel about art, philosophy, history, and science by bringing in views, challenges, arguments that are unshared? So essentially, isn't there a danger of having a sort of canon view that actually you end up with a restricted body of knowledge? How can you bring it? Can you bring in unconventional thinking to your body of shared knowledge, Minister? And the admirably brief question from Amy Gibbons at TES. It's very simple. Would the government be prepared to pass legislation to ban phones in schools? So. Mildly off topic, but I'll allow it. So there you go. How do you bring in unorthodox, heterodox knowledge, and are you to legislate to ban mobile phones from schools?
It's a very good question, Martin's question, and I suppose my point is that you, by having read the canon, you are better equipped then and motivated and able to read on, to read the people that I cited in my speech. It gives you that cognitive ability to go on and select new authors. Who is in the canon, of course, will change over time as well. There should be authors in the canon today who won't have existed when I was at school. And I think there will be a canon that I think a consensus can form around, just to make sure as a minimum that children have read those books, because I do think it, because of the quality of the authors in that canon, that I just think it's so essential that young people are introduced to them. I think it's doing them a disservice to deny them that opportunity. And here we have a new member of the new generation joining us as well.
Yes, sorry. So we were saying, as you know, Nick, not all children are in school this week, and so give me 2 minutes.
And on the issue of
yes, yes. If we had longer on that, if we had another 15 minutes, I'd draw you into a long conversation about the French model of the idea of an academy of immortals deciding on our core culture. But I think that's, come back and we'll talk about that another day. We'll probably end with that question, with Amy's question on legislating for against mobile phones in schools.
Well, what we've said is we think that mobile phones are a distraction, and we're trying to spread best practice. But ultimately, we believe in an autonomous academies school system where these decisions are ultimately made by the profession. But the evidence, and this is what we're seeking to do at the moment, it does demonstrate that this is a very effective way of ensuring that children are focused on the lessons in place. But these are the issues that we are consulting on as we issued a call for evidence to find out from around the country what is the best practice in schools, and then we'll use that evidence to determine the next stage. And I think at the very least it will be revisions to the non-statutory behaviour guidance.
At the very least. Lovely. Well, the clock has just ticked over to 12 o'clock, which is the allotted end of this session. So I'm going to say, I'm going to call things to a halt. I know some people have the questions in the Q&A panel. I'm sorry we haven't managed to put them to the Minister. We will, because you've written them down, we can copy them out. We can send them over to the department. So they will be passed on. They won't be missed. So thank you for all of those contributions. Thank you all very much for coming. And thank you most of all to Nick Gibb for coming to the SMF and looking after our banner so nicely. I hope that the next time we do this, and I'm sure there will be a next time, I and the banner and Nick will be united in the same room, and I look forward to welcoming as many of you as possible to the SMF's familiar, slightly scruffy office on Tufton Street in the new world when we get back there. So, but for now, I'm going to say thank you, Minister. Thank you all.